let's just start by introducing the authors of Joining the Dots. Jonathan Ancer is an award-winning journalist who has worked as a reporter at The Star, a features writer for magazines, and a crossword columnist. I still have to find out, what does a crossword columnist do? Ancer is author of nonfiction books like Betrayal, The Secret Lives of Apartheid Spies. She would like to read all of that, which was published in 2019. It followed his 2017 book, Spy, he likes spies, Uncovering Craig Williamson, which was on the long list for the Alan Paton Literary Prize. Chris Whitfield has been a journalist for 40 years, and he doesn't look like he's been a journalist for 40 years. He is a former editor of the Cape Times and the Cape Argus, the Weekend Argus, and acting editor of The Witness and the Daily Sun. Wow, I wouldn't have thought that there's a relationship between all of the others and the Daily Sun, eh? Do you guys read the Daily Sun? Oh my God, Chris, I missed that one. Prior to becoming an editor, he was a political correspondent for The Star. One of the reasons we're starting late is because my team and I, which was a small team of 3 people, pivoted when we arrived at this venue. And of course, when you pivot in an undirected way, you autopilot into pivoting, your mission gets derailed. What of course is helpful is you have to still remember what was the vision and ask the right people. And incidentally, literally, I told a similar story yesterday, but about a different journey. But exactly the same thing happened today. The first person we asked, because she didn't have all of the information about what we needed, sent us to a different venue, and we went there. It was only once we were there that we re-inquired and got proper directions. And yesterday was April 27. Many were complaining, perhaps even lamenting, that we're not where we should be and where we could be. Today, we're going to listen very briefly to the story behind Joining the Dots. I do realize, of course, that they're not going to tell us everything in the book, because if they do, our hope that you all are going to leave with copies of the book today will not be realized. But it is a story that is similar to what happens. Just imagine a flight that is destined to go to a place. You can imagine any place. Maybe let's say it's going to Iceland. And whilst mid-air, some of the passengers, or people who look like passengers, hijack the flight. And then the flight pivots and it's not going to Iceland. But what if the rest of the crew, having fought with the hijackers and the pilot, discovered that actually it wasn't a normal hijack, that the pilot was part of the plot? Most of the people in this room, or some of the people in this room, are either journalists or people who read about the hijacking of the trucks that would be delivering food or money, etc. And occasionally we discover that actually some of the people involved in the plotting and some of the people who were giving information to the outsiders and enabling them to hijack the truck were people who were supposed to make sure that the truck goes to where it's supposed to go and delivers what it was supposed to deliver. So the story that we're about to listen to in Joining the Dots is a story told by Jonathan Ancer and Chris Whitfield. And as I said, it's a beautiful story, but it's a difficult story told beautifully about one of us who set on a journey to liberate all of us. And in the process, worked with others, but only to discover during that process that some of the people that were working to establish democracy were no longer operating on the basis of the will of the people. They were now operating on the basis of the will of a few. But I don't want to spoil the plot. I want our amazing authors to tell us the story themselves. Let me just start with you, Jonathan. What inspired the story? And just tell us a bit who did what, and then who did what, and then some of the key contents that you would like to disclose. And then I'm going to go to Chris as well to just tell us what are some of the key contents that you would like us to pay attention to, without, of course, giving away the entire contents of the book.
Thank you very much, Thuli. What inspired it for me, and I think Chris and I, we're both journalists and we come from this journalistic background where we're quite skeptical and we're quite cynical. But here was this figure, this towering figure in South Africa's political landscape who had played a pivotal role in helping the country come through its turbulent times. And here he was. He had become the face of the resistance against state capture. And we wanted to know more about him. And that was what inspired me. There had been a lot of accusations about him, allegations that had been made against by some people whose motives are questionable. But we wanted to do this journalistic project where we wanted to find out if Pravin Gordhan was this very rare beast, a clean politician. And that is essentially the journey that we undertook. And that involved going back into his background. There was very, very little about him in the public domain, about where he came from, what his struggle credentials really were. And we decided that we wanted to tell the story. And I think that was the inspiration. The key moments for me were going back into his background. Who did what? I'd have to say Chris did the difficult chapters of the state-owned enterprises and SAA. I did the much easier chapters. Going back into his background, speaking. We both actually did all the interviews together, but the writing process we split up. But speaking to the people that he grew up with in Natal in the 60s, going back into his history, speaking to people he was at university with, and looking at how he got involved in the struggle against apartheid and what actually he did. And the more we spoke to these people in Natal, the more inspired I became. It really was a journey that opened my eyes a lot. A lot of these people, the activists that were, came from Natal in the 60s and 70s, were incredibly courageous people whose stories haven't really been told. They're not really part of our historical record. And I think that's a shame. And one of the objectives of this book was to document some of that. And then also to look at where things went wrong, and how Pravin stood up to the forces of state capture, and then looking at a little bit, into the future where things are likely to go.
Thank you. That's marvelous, except one thing, Jonathan, that I'm not quite sure. We're encouraging young people to go into politics. So if accomplished journalists like yourselves believe that an honest politician is rare, two things that may emerge from that. One is it might discourage honest young people from going into politics, lest they soil their reputation. But second, it might encourage them to think if you can't beat them, join them, because, right. Let's hear from Chris. Just your recollections on why you joined this project, but more importantly, on some of the key contents.
Yeah, I think very, very similar to what Jonathan said. We were actually approached by our publisher to do it because Praveen had been approached himself and had said he doesn't want to write an autobiography. So we were approached, and I must say that initially I kind of thought, a book about a politician, but the more we started finding out about him and talking to former comrades of his, the more intriguing I became. And then that question started coming up: is he clean? Is he clean? Is he clean? And so we started interrogating that. And it was just a very, very fascinating process, and we really enjoyed putting the book together. In fact, when we had, in the early stages, we very quickly realized there are probably 5 or 6 books in that. But we had a brief from the publisher, certain word count, and to make it accessible, readable to people. So we had to pare it down into the essentials. But if I was to go back now and try and write another book out of that, I would write about the so-called Durban Moment, which people don't really know about, I don't think, in this country enough about, where in the 80s, the struggle was starting to lose its momentum in the late 70s, 80s. And it was essentially around Durban that it was regenerated by people like Pravin Gordhan. And then the other one that we kind of forget about is the brutality of the special police, the special branch at the time in KZN. And I think there's actually a book in that I'd like to write. So those are two elements of the book that kind of I didn't anticipate, and which I enjoyed finding out more about. And then obviously the more contemporary stuff is, the question that everybody's asking themselves in this country at the moment, which side of the blade are we going to fall off? The good one or the bad one?
That is quite amazing. And I'm waiting for that book that will talk more broadly about the Durban Moment, even though it is covered here. In chapter 5, the two of you speak, you play on the word captured, which is in this case captured by the state instead of capturing the state. And that's a culmination of Pravin's early political work. Do you think that enough people in this country, I'm talking the ordinary Gogodlamini, knows about that, about Pravin Gordhan's history, other than just being a minister? But do you even think the demagogues themselves, the peacetime revolutionaries, do know about Pravin Gordhan's underground work?
No. I don't think enough people do know. And it's actually quite remarkable. I mean, the fact that he was tortured in one session in which he was tortured, his beard was physically pulled out of his face. And and he was harassed, constantly by the security police. And I don't think people do know enough about that. And it's a struggle that's common to a lot of activists from the time, that has been forgotten. And that's one thing I'm quite proud of in this book, is that, if a young person reads it, they will see for themselves, "Oof, these guys, it was a tough environment."
It seems to me, though, that he didn't set out to join the struggle, Jonathan, that the struggle found him. Do you want to talk a little bit about that without, again, giving out too much?
Yes, so Pravin was born in 1949. He was born, actually, he shares a birthday with Jacob Zuma on the 12th of April. It was quite recently. His family had come from India. His parents had come from India, and they'd settled in the Grey Street area in Durban. And they weren't a political family at all. In fact, he told us with a kind of a smile that he was the black sheep of the family. But he didn't grow up as a political activist. He was aware of the fact that he was discriminated against, because he would go to sports venues, and there were separate entrances. He would go to playgrounds, and he wouldn't be allowed to go on the playground equipment. You'd have to fold his arms because he wasn't allowed to touch the playground equipment. But and when he went to school, there were a couple of teachers that went beyond the syllabus and started to open his eyes a little bit. But it was really when he went to university. The university eventually became Durban Westville, that he started to become politicized. And he was on campus, he was studying pharmacy, and he was on campus during the early 70s, when it was a very, very political time. The Black consciousness movement was starting to make itself heard in campuses across the country, and there were boycotts. And this is where he really became very politically active. And he was involved eventually in the underground. He was involved in the semi-underground, and he was involved above ground. So he devoted his life to the liberation struggle.
Thank you, Jonathan. So basically, it was through his own personal struggles that he found his way into the broader struggle. But what was this notion of a higher purpose that you talk about in chapter 8, and you say that's what drove him then, and that's how seemingly that's been the soundtrack of his life?
Yeah, the great thing about writing a book in tandem with somebody else is when you get a difficult question, you can defer it. Jonathan wrote that chapter, so I'm going to give that one to him.
Back to you, Jonathan.
Well, when Chris talks about each chapter, well, various chapters could be books on themselves. That chapter, The Higher Purpose, I think could be a book on itself. And it looks at when Pravin went into SARS in 1998, and then he became the commissioner in 1999, and how he transformed this institution from one that was inefficient to one that really is a model that's studied by business universities all across the world. And he transformed this institution seamlessly. Well, it seemed to me. And the reason, when we spoke to people who were at SARS with him at the time, is that they spoke about the reason he was able to transform it was what drove him was this idea of a higher purpose. And that's really, and that's a beautiful description, that it's the soundtrack of his life. Because that, just to get back to my inspiration for the story, it was when Pravin was the minister of was it Public Works or Public Enterprises, and he was delivering his budget speech for the department in Parliament, and he was being stormed. The EFF was storming the podium, and I watched that, and I just saw Pravin standing his ground, just standing there with this grim look on his face. And I wanted to know where he got his steely resolve from. And I concluded that it was because of his belief in this higher purpose, and that whatever Pravin does, he's not doing it for himself, but he's doing it for the greater good of the country. And that's something that I came away from this book, looking at his life, the trajectory, is that he really does believe in the greater good. And that, I think, is the higher purpose that he's striving and continues to strive to achieve.
Yeah, sorry if I may. That was a theme that came up time and time again in the interviews we did. People who had worked very closely with him over the years were absolutely unanimous in saying that he was incorruptible and clean and driven by motives that went far beyond his own personal gain.
Remarkable. Maybe my last question before I give people an opportunity to ask questions on this remarkable story, which is also our story, is what were your shocking discoveries regarding state capture, or just the way our democracy has been derailed?
Well, one thing that stood out for me is when we were talking to a very senior official who was contracted at the time to the Department of Public Enterprises. In other words, he was familiar with the issues around state-owned enterprises. And we were trying to get an idea of what Eskom looked like when Pravin Gordhan took over and they walked in the doors. And this guy said that they had anticipated that they would have 10% of the staff would be corrupt. They would be the bad guys who were destroying the thing. 10% would be the good guys who would be the whistleblowers, and 80% would be directed by the other, whichever camp was more persuasive. But he says when they went in there, they found out that the number of people who were involved in the corruption was just absolutely vast, right down to the guy who was parking cars in the car park. That the entire structure from top to bottom had been destroyed. The culture of the working culture, the work ethic had been destroyed. It was absolutely, to my mind, that I found that very shocking, the depths to which state capture had destroyed an institution like that. And I think it's starting to emerge now, if you look at the struggles that people are having to try and get them back into good shape, that it's across the board, just about across the board, the damage that was done in those years.
Do you want to weigh in on that?
Just a sort of a parallel point is that there was also the destruction of good people. So a lot of people that we spoke to, people that were, targeted by these disinformation campaigns, smeared, and people that could make a valuable contribution to this country, their lives were destroyed. The SARS rogue unit allegation, which was really always unfounded. Ivan Pillay, Johan van Lochenberg, Peter Richer, all these people that were efficient, that were, their heart was in the right place. They really wanted to see this country succeed, and they were pushed out and destroyed. And I think that for me was one of the consequences of state capture that has really, taken a toll.
Thank you.
I just wanted to add one other point. While Jonathan was talking, I remembered that the other thing that I felt quite surprised by was how easily the media was manipulated in this country, in this process. As a journalist who believes in journalism, I was very disappointed that, that Sunday Times rogue unit reports, which have absolutely no basis in fact, made it into the paper, and the way they were manipulated, and subsequently other newspapers and other journalists have carried on with the same trend. So that's another another surprising him.
Wow, so many surprises, but also lessons about what it takes to unleash systemic rot in an organization, as you both have pointed out about ESCOM and systemic rot in a country. I remember going to an organization, it's Browns, they do jewelry. And at the door, they have a basket with apples and 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 then I think it's two baskets, the one with rotten apples and implications for the organizations and for the organization, and the one without rotten apple. And the guy was a very nice person, but was very clear that when they have a rotten apple and if it can't be fixed, they just cut it out, because if you don't cut out that rotten apple, you'll soon have a basket of rotten apples, the whole lot. And that's probably what has happened at ESCOM. The two of you now, any of you can start on this one. Looking back, as you say, I think it was Steve Jobs who said the dots don't connect looking forward. Things seem random when you are in them or looking forward. But when you look back and you connect the dots, things start making sense and a pattern emerges. So where is South Africa today when you now connect the dots during state capture and now? But more importantly, how will this book and us reading this book contribute to a better next chapter for this country?
Well, I alluded earlier to this country being on a knife edge, and I must say, writing this book, I emerged from it with far more optimism than I'd had before we started. And the reason is that we interviewed a lot of people who are very committed to the country, who were happy to serve the people of this country, and a lot of them in government still, and the commitment of someone like Praveen himself to making things better. So when we sort of signed off on this book, I had I thought, no, the country can turn things around. Subsequent to that, those riots in Durban took place, which obviously were very depressing and also suggested that there's some very bad people in this country, if you believe that it was an insurrection, which I do. And so I do think at the moment that we're really on a knife edge. Will these guys, the good guys, win, or won't they win? I think we'll find out at the ANC's elective conference later this year.
Thank you. You want to weigh in?
I would just start on the point that you had made about encouraging honest young people to go into politics. I hope that this book does inspire that they can see that there are actually honest people and good people who are committed to the higher purpose, committed to the country. I do feel optimistic about the future, cautiously optimistic. I think that there are enough good people, and I think I just hope that they declare themselves.
Thank you. It is an Eastern saying that a grain of sand can tip the scales. And hopefully the people in this room, this book, and all of the people who are doing good can tip the scales. Right. This is your opportunity to ask the authors some questions. I do not promise that they will answer your questions fully because they still want you to buy the book. But I think they will answer the questions honestly. Yes, sir, at the back there.
Thanks so much. Fascinating book and fascinating panel. So you've called it the unauthorized biography. Why? And why didn't he want an autobiography? And maybe has he responded to the book in some way that you would be comfortable to share?
Yes. So, as Chris pointed out, he was first asked if he would be willing to write his autobiography, and he said no. And so then we were approached, and the very first thing that we did is we tried to get hold of him, and we went through all the people that we know that has that can speak to him and on our behalf, and we kept on getting the same response. Pravin is private. Pravin doesn't like to talk about himself. Pravin is actually very shy. And so we decided we'd go ahead anyway. But we did realize quite soon that in order to connect the dots, we actually needed to speak to him. So it was always an independent work. He had no say in it. He had no oversight. We didn't send him any chapters. We just wanted him to cooperate with us. So he cooperated, but he didn't collaborate. And we did get to interview him, and in fact, I think we had about 8 hours of his time, which when he's, and it was always, he always stuck to, when he said he was available, he stuck to that. He always gave us he was very generous with his time. But at no point did he say, you can't talk about that, you can't write about this, you can't interview that person. And so he never controlled what we wrote. And so we thought it was important to say that it was an unauthorized biography, so that people understand that the conclusions that we came to are our own and not his, and that he had absolutely no say in what we wrote. And as for what he thinks of it, well, we did send him a copy of the book, but he never responded. But at the launch in Pretoria, his wife came to the launch, and so we took that as a good sign. But we don't quite know what he thinks of it. But yeah.
Well, the good thing is he hasn't repudiated it. Right. Thank you. More questions? You, sir?
My question simply is, why is Pravin Gordhan still in cabinet, given all the chaos that happened there? Why is he still there? That is a short and sweet question, I think.
Okay, the authors can answer it, except I must indicate that this book talks to the time before he is in the current position. But let them answer.
Yeah.
His biographers.
It's a question that we asked a lot, and a lot of his former comrades and people who are close to him also asked that question: why is he carrying? And I think it's the answer is in what Jonathan suggested earlier, is in that higher purpose. He believes in service, and he still believes, without a doubt, that things can turn around in this country. And I think until he can no longer manage to get out of bed in the morning, he'll carry on working on it.
Can I just add?
Interesting answer.
After that whole Neni, when Neni, Neni was fired, and that whole weekend, he was Jacob Zuma then asked him if he would be the finance minister again, and he didn't want it at all. And he phoned his wife and he discussed it with her, and she said, yes, okay, you should do it. But there were a number of times that he wanted to walk away, and he kept on sort of being convinced to go back. And he's taken a huge sort of toll on his health. But there were a number of times that he felt that he should turn away, but he kept on not being able to, because of this idea that he still has something to contribute.
Thank you. So the answer is that he still thinks that cabinet is a vehicle where he can still pursue the higher purpose. Right.
Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you very much to both.
Sorry, ma'am. You say.
Is it ladies first or?
No, say I hadn't
Very
seen
well.
you.
No, thank you very much. It's I took the safe precaution to buy the book, so I've already got it, and I now realize that I haven't made a mistake. Be that as it may, it's perhaps a very difficult question, but I think it's a fair question. Is how would you summarize Pravin Gordhan's political life in one sentence? It's like asking somebody, what does the Bible tell you in one sentence? It's very difficult. But if you were to do that, what would you say to us today?
Well, let's throw in a few words. I would say courage, commitment, principle, integrity. Not really a sentence, but those sort of things. And I find it actually quite remarkable that the two of us are sitting here saying this kind of thing because, you know, Jonathan's previous book was a very damning book about Craig Williamson. We don't set out to deify people. But I must say with him, I think he's a remarkable human being.
That's also just to say that it's not. We didn't only write about his good things. There were people who had negative things to say about him, people that he worked with. So it's not this completely rosy picture. He can be a very difficult person because he's quite demanding and quite exacting. And people who have crossed paths with him in that context were nervous about working with him.
Yeah, you don't want to get on the wrong side of him, that's for sure.
Wonderful. Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
So can we use Pravin Gordhan as a yardstick for the ANC today? Should we continue to support the ANC? Should good people continue to remain there?
That's definitely one
Thank you,
for
ma'am. What a difficult question. Jonathan?
I'm not sure how to answer that. I think it is a very difficult question. I think he remains loyal to the ANC, and that's quite clear. They were also, when people were telling him that it was time to leave cabinet, there were also people telling him it's time to leave the ANC, and he was absolutely convinced that he wasn't going to. He felt that he could. I don't know if the word is recalibrate or that the ANC could be salvaged, and I think he still believes that. Although we don't speak on his behalf, we're not his spokesman. So maybe it would be better if he answered that. But I do think that he remains loyal, and he would tell you to support the ANC. I think he would.
Yeah, and as to
Thank you, sir.
sorry, as to your suggestion that is he a yardstick for the ANC, I would say no. He's a yardstick for one faction of the ANC, and what I hope is that he's on the winning team, but who knows?
Thank you, dear colleagues. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Chris, seeing that you the reflection of Pravin, according to facial image, how does your life compare to the one with the darker skin? And is it the end of the media? Thank you.
Very complex, not difficult, complex.
Yeah, I mean, I can't compare. I begin to compare myself to a person like him. I grew up with all the privilege that being white gave me, and I don't have anything like the courage he's got. And yeah, so I just can't. I mean, there's just no comparison. And is it the end of the media? No, I don't think so. There are still a lot of people in the media with integrity. the investigative journalism has played an absolutely critical role in exposing state capture. And I mean, if you read the Zondo Commission reports, they haven't really found a new broad sweep of corruption. They've gone back to the stuff that's been exposed by journalists. So journalism remains absolutely critical to this country. It's not in a great shape, but there are very good journalists around, and the role of the media is still central to any democracy.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you, ma'am. Any more questions? You want a second bite, sir?
I was thinking to myself, I wonder if Pravin asks his comrades or think about why did the state capture happen? What was the reason for state capture? And he was part of the inner circle in the ANC when that happened. But what was the actual reason? Was it, we want to be better off? We had always lived in apartheid, being last. Now we want to be first. So what do you think about that question? Did you ask him that? Or what do you think? The reason for state capture.
We did ask him. We were quite curious about when, as you point out, he was in the inner circle. He was in the cabinet. Zuma had appointed him in that 2009 cabinet, so he was right there. He had a front row seat, and we were quite curious about, well, when did he realize, and when did he decide to take a stand against it? And so, you know, it was something that we managed to interview his wife, and she was an activist in Natal at that time, and she was much more heartbroken about what had become of the ANC and the corruption. But I think to sum it up, he felt that it was greed, that there were people who had just become overwhelmed by the greed, by being greedy, and that is what what motivated them. And then it was another surprising thing is that how easy it was for the Gupta family to buy a president. I don't know.
Thank you, Jonathan. Do you concur, Chris? Do you want to add something?
No. No, it's a good answer. Yeah. And I mean, I think the specific moment where he realized something was rotten was around simultaneously the arms deal and SAA were going a bit pear-shaped. And I think that round about that time is where he suddenly said, whoa, no, I've got to make a stand.
Right. Can I throw a spanner in the works? I've always thought that state capture was inspired by greed. But I've been reflecting on a different theory. I haven't concluded it. That was greed the main driver, or was greed a secondary driver? And I'm looking now as the governing party is going into its internal elections and what's going to come of that. And I don't see greed driving people wanting to get into positions. I see subversion of justice as a driver. And I've started asking myself whether that was not really the main driver of state capture, and that greed became a means to subverting the rule of law as opposed to the key to state capture, at least in the manner, in that particular section of state capture that became the core of the state capture investigation.
Yeah, it's a difficult question and a very interesting suggestion. I do concur that, you know, the lust for power perhaps was a major motivator, and greed accentuated it all. And
Power to do what? Was it not power not to go to jail? As
Well,
many people are now trying to position themselves to go into government.
but
it's something
without a
to
doubt, that
reflect
is
on.
now a
Yeah.
motivation of a lot of what's going on, undermining of investigative authorities and the like. There's people trying to stay out of jail. But you know, if you look at the original moment that kicked it all off, which I don't know when that was, but if one tries to put one's head into that moment, it's got to involve the Guptas. And what were the Guptas doing? They were just stealing the country blind. So greed was an element of it, without a doubt.
Thank you, Chris. Any thoughts? You don't have to.
It's something that I'll think about, but yeah.
Right. We have another 5 minutes or so. We had allocated a little bit more time, so if you do have questions, please do ask. Yes, sir.
When you say I beg your pardon, when you say subversion of justice, to what end would you say? If you could just expand on that a bit more, please. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Well, it's these two guys that are supposed to answer questions. I'm just a questioner like you, sir. But I must indicate that it's something. I'm writing my own autobiographies. Maybe I shouldn't. I should have gotten you guys to write it. Then I wouldn't have to ponder these difficult questions. Is that the theory I began to ask myself is that I know the public narrative is that the Guptas captured the state of South Africa. But the state capture report doesn't say that. It says the Zuma family and the Gupta family captured the state of South Africa. Because in the public narrative, then there's less agency given to Zuma and his son, and therefore it's all like they're just there free riding on the profits of state capture, but they're not actively involved in state capture. Yet if you look at what was proven in London already by the PR investigation agency on the origins of the white monopoly capital campaign and the slogan, radical economic transformation. Because you must remember, President Zuma was in office for nearly 2 decades, and radical economic transformation and white monopoly capital only emerged into the public narrative in South Africa once we had started investigating state capture. But where does it come from? It comes from London, from Bell Pottinger. But who hired Bell Pottinger? President Zuma's son. And here we're not talking speculation. We're talking about what has been proven in law. President Zuma's son and the Guptas. But who were the companies that were benefiting from state capture? We keep saying it's the Guptas. But all of those companies were co-owned by President Zuma's son and the Guptas. So we make it appear as if the Zuma family are just, you know, a normal corrupted person who just gets kickbacks. But we're not seeing them as at the core of capturing and repurposing state organs for law enforcement, subversion. But you must remember, for example, why did President Zuma go into power? At some stage, he had said he didn't want even a second term. But there was that problem of the perennial problem of potentially going to jail because of the arms deal. And therefore, what's the best way of ensuring a future? I mean, in strategy, they train us to say that the best way to predict the future is to create it yourself or take control of it. So that's a theory that I'm working with. I'm not saying it's a fact. Also for everybody in this room, I'm not saying it's a fact, but I'm beginning to say the state was captured by President Zuma and his family and the Guptas, he wasn't a free rider in a state that was captured by the Gupta family. I don't know if you have any comments on that.
Well, I'm looking forward to reading your book.
It's a theory. It's not a fact. Okay, please, questions. Yes, sir.
Good morning to the panel. Thank you for the interesting conversation thus far. As you are talking, I'm debating you. And so every time you say something, I try and have a counterpoint. And the one thing that seems to stand out for me is that when you tell me that he was clean, you used other terms also. And my response to that is like, hey, birds of a feather flock together. Is this man, was he strong enough, or was he so fickle, knowing that what was going on around him, that he was unable to stand up and say something in order to change things? This is my debate, but that's my question to you. Thank you.
I do think he did stand up. I mean, when he became alert to what Jacob Zuma was doing around SAA and the nuclear power deal, he started to resist it. From the Treasury, they put up blocks to it. And I do think that, you know, obviously the people do ask the question is how could he have stuck out with the ANC when it was corrupt all those years? And I mean, that's a question I'd like to put to him. But I do think that he never went along with any of the bad stuff. I think he always, he stood up when he was needed, when it was required.
Thank you, Chris. Jonathan?
That is something that we sort of were very keen on pursuing. How did he get to be in Jacob Zuma's cabinet? And we asked somebody who was very close to him at the time in 2009, and he was saying, you know, we tend to forget that we'd just come out of this power struggle between Thabo Mbeki and Jacob Zuma, and there was a sense in the ANC that not everybody realized the extent of Jacob Zuma's kind of ability to capture himself or be captured, and there was a sense that we coming out there had been the whole AIDS denialism, and some people had thought, well, Zuma's going to be a breath of fresh air. So it wasn't always apparent. The corruption wasn't always apparent to the people that were coming in this sort of new cabinet. But certainly when that nuclear deal, he was called to a meeting, and he was told that there was going to be this nuclear deal with Russia, and he must just sign off on it. And he you know, for him that was the line in the sand. And you must remember that when he agreed to become finance minister for the second time, the knives were out for him. The hawks came after him. He was under incredible pressure, but he stood up and he resisted. So it is a very good question, you know, and it was something that we were, you know, like, when did you stand up? How long did it take? And there were a number of people in cabinet. It wasn't only Pravin, but there were a number of people. But at that time, the forces were very strong against people who were standing up. It wasn't easy to do. So yes, it's a good question, and there aren't any easy answers. But I think that when he found out, when he realized, he knew what he had to do.
Satisfied, sir. Thank you. Any further question? Yes, ma'am. Do we have a question from that side? You have an opportunity to ask. Yes, ma'am. Any other person? Yes, ma'am. Okay, it's going to be you, ma'am, then you. Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Okay, it's not a question. It's just a comment. When two ships pass each other at night, Chris White is going this way, Chris is going this way, and Pravin is going that way. Now, the Bible teaches me that it has 66 books. So if I look at the Bible, Chris and Pravin, I wonder, it was the Zoo mothers that brought Zuma into power, because it was the Zoo mothers who were raising pets in their home. I'm just wondering, I don't know if Chris has any kids. I'm not sure how many kids Pravin has, but I can tell you it's more than 66. Thank you.
Sure. You speak in parables, ma'am. But thank God I'm not the one being questioned. I don't. Well, it's just a comment.
It's a
you see.
comment, yeah.
Thank you, ma'am.
I've got 3 daughters.
Okay, so my question is, I think the discussion up to now has been quite serious and heavy, and probably your journey in writing this book has also been quite serious and heavy. I'd like to know, along your journey, were there any, call it the lighter side of it? Did you unearth anything that was, call it humoristic or light or funny?
Wow.
What was your lightest point on this journey of writing this book?
Thank you. Maybe let's address that before we go to the next one. Light moments, please.
There were a number of times that, you know, Chris and I would do the interviews together, and this is all off the record, of course. But one of the people that we interviewed was Johan van Lochenberg, who's a meticulous document taker. So when we set up the interview, he sent us a message saying, you will have to read all the documents that I'm going to send to you. And suddenly my cell phone was going, I mean, it must have gone for 3-4 hours straight with, you've got to read this article, you've got to read this article, you've got to read this article, just lists and lists of articles that we had to read. And eventually, I mean, we couldn't read it all. You know, it was, I mean, hundreds, I think. And then when we started to interview him, we had set out, 2 hours for the interview. And after 2 hours, he was still talking. And after 3 hours, he was still talking. And then eventually, you know, I had to get going. I had to go home, but he just wasn't stopped. He just couldn't stop talking.
Yeah, the one thing that I remember that made us smile was our first interview with Praveen. We'd been really battling to get to him, and people had told us, no, you're never going to speak to him. And then one of his staff said, okay, kind of join us on Teams. And so we're sitting there smiling at the screen, and Praveen pops up, and we just look at him, and we were literally there just to introduce ourselves and say hi. And he says, okay, what's your first question? First time in our lives that as journalists, we just didn't know what to say. We just sat there looking at him.
So another moment is when we were interviewing him, and then we noticed that actually he's listening to the cricket as well, and he's attending another meeting. He's a multitasker.
That is actually an astonishing ability that he has, and a lot of people told us about it, is that he is always doing more than one thing at the same time.
Thank you, Chris and Jonathan. Ma'am, you have the floor.
I was just wondering whether the fact that Pravin Gordhan stayed in the cabinet, knowing that there were things going on, isn't that out of loyalty? Because, as you said, I mean, he's absolutely committed to the future of South Africa. And had he not been there, because you can only change an organization from within, had he not been there when this nuclear deal was proffered, who knows how somebody else might have been bought and it would have gone on.
Yeah, I've no doubt that he in his mind, he believes he can be more effective from within those structures than outside them. And I think that is probably quite a significant element in the fact that he has stuck it out.
Thank you, Chris.
Sorry, can I
Any
just say
addition?
one little thing is that, what we believe is that he was the first finance minister in Zuma's government, and he didn't want to go ahead with the nuclear deal. And Zuma then demoted him and got in Nkandla Nene because he thought he would be able to he thought Nene would do his bidding. But Nene absolutely refused. And I think that also is testament to the fact that it wasn't only Pravin who was standing up, it was people who paid very heavy prices for their integrity and their principle. And one of them, I think, is Nkandla Nene.
Thank you, Jonathan. Right. Do we still have any final questions? None. Okay, you're going to have the last word, ma'am.
Hi, I asked this question at the risk of not knowing what's in the book, right? I was a comrade of Pravin Gordhan in the early days, in the 80s in Durban. And I'm just wondering, to what extent did he actually acknowledge the role that the trade union movement and the cultural movement, he was a cultural activist, to what extent did he acknowledge the role of all of those other organizations and other individuals like Fatima Mir within the struggle in the early 80s?
Yeah, he repeatedly during the interviews deflected any suggestion that he was central to it, that to other people. He was very, I guess the word might be, generous about acknowledging other people's role in the struggle. He's not a vain man. He didn't talk about himself in a way that suggested that he was central to anything. He did acknowledge the roles played by others. It was other people who told us that he had been significant at certain junctions in South African history.
Perhaps I would ask Jonathan to mention just some of the names that are mentioned as his contemporaries and his collaborators, not cooperators, collaborators in and particularly in the 80s,
yes,
up to chapter 5, I think, yes.
Yeah. So he talks a lot about this concept of mobilization and how it was, how they got involved. But it was people like Yusuf Wouda, Ghulam Abu Baker, who I see is on the board of the Jakes Gerwel Foundation, Sunny Singh, Jay Naidu, Abba Omar, who am I missing? Sandy Africa. They were just a whole host of people that we were lucky enough to speak to.
They're all there in the book. So.
Ivan Pillay.
So that's a good reason to buy the book, to find out who's omitted and who's included. Right. At this stage, I would like to thank all of you for participating in this conversation this morning, and more importantly, to thank our talented colleagues, Jonathan Ancer and Chris Whitfield, who have taken a difficult story but told it so beautifully and accessibly. It is a story of Pravin Gordhan, but the last question just confirms that it is not his story alone. It is the story of what happened to bring South Africa into the democratic phase that kicked in 1994. But it's also a story of how we got derailed by allowing the democratic journey to be hijacked. But it's also a story of hope and faith. But Pravin and his contemporaries believed in a future they had never seen, a future of a South Africa that belongs to all who live in it, and a future of a South Africa we could collaborate for our common good. They believed in it, and they brought us the Constitution. This book suggests that we can still believe that that future is possible, but some work needs to be done. And hopefully it will start with just buying a copy of this book and many other books that are telling the story of what happened, what should have happened, and what could happen to get us back on track.